Hey guys, quick PSA before the actual video begins. I'm back on Twitch. I'm streaming once again every Tuesday and Thursday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Oh, hello, cat. If that sounds appealing to you, click the link right here, give me a follow, and I hope to see you there. Hey, what is up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. It's been a minute since I've gotten to upload. Real life has just been super busy. I went out of town for a little bit, so obviously couldn't work on YouTube stuff during that time, but I'm back. I'm glad to be back. And ladies and gentlemen, as of the recording of this video, we are at 253 subscribers. That's right, we are ever growing. I love to see it. If you enjoy the content and the way I present my stuff, then do please consider subscribing. FROMSOFT has provided some of the most iconic releases in gaming, and several of my favorite titles of all time. Dark and moody atmospheres, thought-provoking themes and messages, cryptic storytelling, and a once unconventional gameplay style that has now become more commonplace and transformed into a genre all its own. But despite my fanship of the studio and their lineage of releases, Bloodborne was a title that sat on my shelf for years. Whether this was due to other games pulling me in different directions, or my stubbornness waiting for that forever rumored 60 FPS patch. But here in 2023, that fire for more Soulsborne goodness suddenly ignited within me. And with fire came disparity, heat and cold, life and death, and of course, a Lunatunes review. So of all the games in my backlog, Bloodborne was probably my most anticipated to finally experience. Many deem Bloodborne to be the pinnacle of FromSoft releases, better than your Demon Souls, your Dark Souls 3, your Elden Rings, and Sekiros. So you can imagine my anticipation and, for better or worse, massively high expectations. But to be clear, I'm not the one to let other people's opinions shape my own views on a game, so as we go through this, don't think that my thoughts are anyone else's but my own. Because as I said, many deem Bloodborne to be the greatest release in FromSoft's lineage of games, and while I very much enjoyed it, frankly, it's nowhere near my own top spot. And that's kind of where I'd like to start today's conversation. Yeah, I could go line by line and talk about the story, the combat, the level design, and we will certainly touch on those things later in the video, but I think I want to start with why I think Bloodborne is held in such high regard, and conversely, why it ended up not climbing the ranks of my own personal Soulsborne experiences. And when thinking about what has led to Bloodborne's heightened status, I think the first major factor has to do with its time of release. So FromSoft's Souls lineage of games all begin with Demon Souls in 2009. This was followed up by Dark Souls 1 and 2 before Bloodborne makes its appearance in 2015. Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro follow relatively quickly, and finally Elden Ring caps us off in 2022. You see, in terms of release order, Bloodborne acts as a transition from what I call the old Souls to the new Souls. The old Souls consists of Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1, and Dark Souls 2. These titles, while incredible in their own right, demonstrate a certain level of jank, some visual limitations, and even less fleshed out or accessible systems than what we can find in more modern releases. Whereas the new Souls consists of Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, and Elden Ring. The new Souls titles have totally revamped visuals thanks to technological improvements of the PS4 and beyond. The environments could be more heavily detailed, and the way items react to the world's physics engines provide a greater sense of realism. Finally, graphics are able to meet Dark Souls' remarkable atmosphere in the middle, creating jaw-dropping vistas and action sequences. The controls and general combat were more fine-tuned as well, especially with Bloodborne featuring quick dashes as opposed to rolls, and a heal regen system that encourages an aggressive playstyle, or Sekiro, whose combat systems were adjusted to focus on a singular weapon of the katana, featuring rhythmic parrying and a variety of ninja maneuvers. We also begin to see more accessibility-centric decisions being made by FROMSOFT developers. Gone are the days of the perilous ancient dragon run back in Dark Souls 2. Instead, we're more likely to find a lamppost or a site of grace directly outside of a boss room. And speaking of bosses, they began to feature multiple stages and transformations as their health bar depletes. Not to say there aren't multi-staged boss fights within the old Souls series of games, but after Bloodborne, it became much more consistent and essentially an expectation of every major battle going forward. There were other changes and adjustments made to the newer Souls series of games, but I think I've made my point when it comes to the heavy pivot that was taken during Bloodborne's release. So when you consider all of this, you can understand just how mind-blowing Bloodborne must have been at launch for a longtime Souls fan. Imagine that transition for a player back in 2015 whose only Souls experience were the likes of Dark Souls 1 and 2, jumping into this beautiful, fast-paced, and modernized experience that is Bloodborne. One might argue that this shock factor may have something to do with the extreme amounts of love and admiration that this title has garnered. It reminds me of my own relationship to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. That title changed my perception of video games as a medium when it first released, and despite its sequel, Tears of the Kingdom, making its debut and objectively improving on much of the base formula, I still find that I have a greater appreciation for the original title due to that explosive introduction to a game the likes of which I had never seen before. But what do you think? Does Bloodborne's reputation benefit from that shock factor, that transition from the old Souls to the new? Or am I just drawing up a make-believe narrative? Let me know in the comments down below. But for me, having already beaten every other Soulsborne title out there, Bloodborne just lacked that initial punch, that shock factor that other players might have felt during their initial playthrough back in 2015. And on top of that, there were just certain aspects of the game that didn't mesh with me or live up to my other Soulsborne experiences. And just note that virtually all of my complaints come from the first third of the game, so maybe the initial 8 to 10 hours, anything prior to fighting Vicar Amelia. And I will absolutely touch on some positive notes as well, but I want to get my grievances out of the way first, starting with a lack of environmental variety. In that opening portion of the game, we are shown to the dark, foggy streets of Yharnam, followed by the dark, foggy streets of Yharnam, and who can forget the iconic dark, foggy streets of Yharnam. And don't get me wrong, this is an incredible setting that oozes the twisted horrors that we all love with Soulsborne titles, and I feel that in isolation, this is one of the best settings we've ever seen in a FROMSOFT game. But as interesting as it was, by the time I got to Vicar Amelia, I was really craving a mix-up. Seeing the same cobblestone roads, crooked railings, and abandoned churches over and over made each section of Yharnam blend in with the last. I'm so used to distinct environmental change-ups. Oftentimes my brain relates each enemy type or boss firmly with the region they're found in. But the early bosses in Bloodborne all reside within that same general aesthetic, which just kind of blended everything together for me and felt a bit stagnant. To help with this, I would have liked to explore more interiors of some buildings or be sent underground before eventually re-emerging onto the streets of Yharnam hours later. It should also be noted that nearly the entire game takes place at night, which makes perfect sense for the story, but I'm already not the biggest fan of overly dark games, like visually dark, you know what I'm saying? And Bloodborne certainly took that to a new extreme at times. Although you do get the occasional glimpse of the sun, and the sky does change color as you progress further into the game. Every other FROMSOFT title, despite their commitment to the grotesque and violent imagery, still offered beautiful and even tranquil set pieces and vistas. Gorgeous scenes to just break up the stress of its soul-crushing gameplay and otherwise dreary setting. I really didn't find much of a reprieve in Bloodborne. It was just constant terror, more akin to a straight-up horror game than anything else I'd played from this studio. And that's not really a bad thing. I like a good spooky game. You'll just be hard-pressed to find any sort of R&R during your time in Yharnam. Even the Hunter's Dream didn't provide a sense of safety and warmth like a Firelink shrine or a dilapidated temple did. I also found the armor selection to be extremely weak early on. Through those initial 8 to 10 hours, I only found 1 or 2 different armor sets hidden within the world, and the standard vendors at the Hunter's Dream never sold anything of value. The Insight vendors had a better selection, like the Gascon or Ash Hunter set, but that still pales in comparison to most, if not all, of the other Souls titles, Sekiro excluded, of course. And for a game with drip this heavy, I was feeling extremely disappointed. I just really thought Fashion Souls was going to be elevated into an entirely new dimension with this title, and at times it was, but even the coolest looking armor can get a bit tiresome after you've worn it for half the game. But my biggest gripe has to come down to the way the story is presented. Not the story itself, the content is great, but again, the way it's laid out to us. Because yes, it's still chock full of environmental storytelling and item descriptions, which is arguably my favorite aspect of these games, and the overall narrative was well thought out and compelling. But the major drops of information felt so few and far between. The lack of significant boss drops in particular was so depressing to me. I'm used to defeating a great enemy and being treated to a glimpse into their origin via their boss soul description. But oftentimes, the item received in Bloodborne from a boss was just a common chalice dungeon relic or a very small piece of the overall puzzle that was Bloodborne's story. Sometimes the piece of information obtained had nothing to do with the boss itself. I very much like to learn about the beasts I'm dispatching, and while some had deeper lore to dive into, most felt pretty surface level. On top of that, we spend so much time in that initial setting of Yharnam without too much of an expansion on the town's lore. We discover pretty early on that the Healing Church is responsible for the Beastly Scourge, and for the initial 8 to 10 hours, there's not a whole lot else to dive into. So when you combine that with the slow dispersal of armor and weapons, the lack of environmental variety, the sense of progression just wasn't hitting for me. 2 other very quick complaints. I'm not a big fan of blood vials. I do not like that your primary method of healing is tied to a consumable item that occasionally requires you to grind. Not a fan of that. Give me my Estus flasks. The other thing is that I can't just rest at a lamppost. Sometimes you just want to reset the world, respawn some enemies, or regain a little bit of health just by resting at a lamppost. Not an option. You have to travel all the way back to the Hunter's Dream and then to your original lamppost, which requires 2 load screens and, I don't know, just a decent chunk of time. I don't know why this change was made for Bloodborne. I don't really see any rhyme or reason for it, but it was very annoying. So now that everybody thinks I hated this game or that I'm the king of bad takes, I can touch on some positive stuff. Because after Vicar Amelia, the environmental variety really started to pick up for me. We're introduced to haunted forests, an abandoned lakeside planetarium, a twisted university, various caves and swamps, an ancient castle buried in snow, and reality-warping nightmare realms that gave me exactly what I was looking for earlier on. We do return to Yharnam several times, but it's fine because the game's settings have been broken up more evenly. To coincide with the environments, I have to gush about the level design. This is probably the best FROMSOFT level design since Dark Souls 1, and if you're at all familiar with the ins and outs of Lordran, then you know that's a compliment of the highest regard. Regions that loop on top of one another, secret areas, shortcuts and elevators, intricately thought out passages akin to a Metroidvania-style map. The feeling of climbing a ladder in the Hemwick Forest and suddenly popping out at the Cathedral Ward stomped my brain into mush. My complaints about the armor and lore also began to alleviate with more plentiful drops in the open world and greater explanations of the Great Ones and major factions that inhabit each region. We also need to comment on what I feel is the defining feature of Bloodborne, that being the contrasting tone that this game carries when compared to other titles in the series. The Bearer of the Curse, Chosen Undead, The Ashen One, all of these titles belong to heroes within their own respective stories, but what they have in common is that they are weak, cursed beings tackling immensely powerful creatures against impossible odds. They are stories of underdogs, challenging the reign of gods. But Bloodborne is different. We are the hunter, and the great beasts we encounter are our prey. Everything from the opening cutscene, the game's choice of music, our character design, and even the swiftness of our movements are there to promote the idea that we are the alpha predator of this world. It's even explicitly stated when we overcome each boss, where in previous games the message was akin to "great foe defeated." Bloodborne provides a prey slaughtered message. Not defeated, not overcame, not "yay, congratulations, you did it." No. You slaughtered that motherfucker. And it's badass. I also love that excessive spraying of blood with each swing of your weapon. Obviously, the theme of blood is extremely heavy in Bloodborne, and the other games are not shy to gore whatsoever, but man, you can really feel and see the difference when your character is drenched from head to toe. I quickly touched on the movement of Bloodborne being a bit faster paced, but combat in general has hastened a bit and promotes a more aggressive playstyle with the newly introduced health regen system. Taking damage isn't the end-all be-all in Bloodborne. You do have a couple of seconds to respond with damage of your own that can replenish some of your lost health. Now, I just have to point out that a lot of people talk about this health regen system like it's the most revolutionary thing in gaming and that it completely warps the FROMSOFT formula, and it does change some things a bit, but I just don't want to oversell it here. It's a fun change, a good tweak, but at the end of the day, I still felt like I was playing a Souls game. The bigger change, in my opinion, has to be the trick weapons. There are far fewer weapons to choose from in Bloodborne when compared to the other titles, but each has the ability to morph into two separate forms. My weapon of choice was the Kirkhammer, which morphs between a nimble, one-handed sword and a giant fucking mallet. Just by pressing L1, you can seamlessly swap between the two, even in the middle of a swing, which can be helpful to extend your combos. It's quite ingenious, and I would love to see this return in some way with future releases. They've also introduced a new counter system with your offhand firearm. At first, you may think your pistol or shotgun is used for straight damage, when in reality, you have to time your shots just right to down your opponent and leave them open to a critical strike. So I think it goes without saying, the movement and combat were fantastic, and you could definitely argue that some aspects of later titles were indeed a step back in this regard. But the last major aspect for me to cover would be the FROMSOFT bread and butter. The bosses. All in all, I'd say there were 2 to 3 stinkers, 2 to 3 S-tier bosses, and the rest were just plain good. The Witches of Himwick, stinker. Mikolash, stinker. Rom the Vacuous Spider, stinker. But then you've got Father Gascon, S-tier. Gehrman the First Hunter, S-tier. The Bloodstarved Beast and the One Reborn I thought were fantastic. I don't know how everyone else feels about them, but I give them near an S-tier. The monster designs were all very unique and varied, no reskins or duplicates like we sometimes find in other titles. Needless to say, I mostly had a good to great time with each of the game's bosses. And note that sadly, I didn't play any of the DLC. I know there are some beloved bosses there as well, but we're just covering the base game in this video. But I really never hit a major wall or felt that any fight was egregiously unfair. A good variety of larger-than-life monsters and subtly dangerous humanoid enemies. The boss arenas provided good variation in shape, size, and obstacles that could potentially be used for cover. And just the general designs or the aesthetic of the arenas were downright gorgeous. So I think that's where we are with Bloodborne. Some fantastic, some underwhelming, ultimately another fantastic release by FromSoftware as usual, but not one I would even place in my top 3 personal list. So now the question is for you, was I just objectively wrong with some of my criticisms, or did what I say possibly have some truth to it? No matter how you feel, leave a comment down below and let's talk some Bloodborne. Like, subscribe, share the video around, and we'll catch you on the next one. Peace.